Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to our Southern Fire Exchange webinar today. My name is David Godwin and I am the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. Today we're excited to feature a presentation by Karen Cummins. She is the Geospatial Database Administrator at Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy in Tallahassee, Florida. Karen will be sharing a presentation today on new work to map prescribed fires across the Southeast using an unprecedented amount of state permit data. So as we said earlier, our presenter today is Karen Cummins. Karen has 20 years of experience applying geospatial technologies as a decision-making tool to prioritize conservation areas and environmental impacts. She's previously managed grant projects and served on project advisory committees for forestry and environmental restoration. Karen has an MS in rangeland ecology from Texas A&M University and currently works as a Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy at Tallahassee as their geospatial database administrator. So enough of an introduction. Let's get on and see the presentation. So thanks, Karen. Welcome. We're glad to have you with us here today. Thanks everybody who's joining us. And 1 second as we just trade out slideshows.
Thanks, David, for the nice introduction. David said we just wanted to discuss our burn permit geodatabase that the Tall Timbers Geospatial Lab started. It was back in 2021. And we worked on this with the great help of all the Southeastern states. So I don't feel like this is a solo effort. And this has really helped us map out and find patterns spatially and temporally regarding prescribed burns across the Southeast. I just always love showing this picture. This is my first burn at Tall Timbers, and a researcher was setting up game cams after the burn to see what animals would be interested in the roasted seeds and nuts and insects after the fire. And I just always laugh at it because we're not the only species that enjoys a good barbecue. So how can we map prescribed burns, especially on a regional level? So there is federal prescribed fire data nationally that shows burned areas. But since there's a lot of private land ownership and it dominates the Southeast, federal data alone can't represent all the prescribed fire activity. And the best nationwide reporting of this is from Mark Melvin, who conducted surveys of all the state forestry agencies of state-level summaries of prescribed burning. But unfortunately, it lacks that finer scale spatial detail and with temporal patterns. It just gives you the years. And then, of course, there are remote sensing products that use Landsat and MODIS satellite products. And the USGS and NASA, they provide this burned area product, and it does reveal really good patterns of fire, but unfortunately, you really can't differentiate between prescribed fires and wildfires, and it has this really coarse temporal resolution too. So to fill in the gap, we developed the Southeastern U.S. Prescribed Fire Geodatabase. This database spans over 11 years from 2010 to 2020, and it has 12 of the Southeastern states: Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. So when we say a burn permit or burn notification, what are we talking about? So in many of the Southeastern states, state forestry agencies have a formal authorization system to track prescribed fire occurrence by day and approximate location. And other states may have a burn notification system or voluntary data submissions provided by both public and private entities. It is important to note that a burn permit just provides an authorization to burn. So it may not mean that the burn actually took place. there's a high likelihood that it did, probably 95%, but maybe it wasn't completed. And part of the burn unit would need to be burned the following day, requiring yet another permit. So it's good to keep that in mind when you're looking at this data. And then when I say geodatabase, what am I talking about? It's basically a database, and it's especially designed to store spatial data. So if the burn permit or notification data doesn't have a location, it was not included in the project. So 13 states make up the Southeast as defined by the Southern Group of State Foresters. And this is just a snapshot of all the raw burn permit data that we were able to receive from those states from 2010 to 2020. We first wrote letters to all the state foresters and asked them to share permit data. And so each state has their own system. So we needed to keep track of how they collected data. Was it required or was it voluntary? For instance, we know Oklahoma and Texas, just looking at this, does far more prescribed burning than what is depicted here. But permits are not required for these states or only partially. We were unable to obtain data for Kentucky until 2022, since the State Forestry Agency didn't collect this data. And I'll talk a little bit more about the data updates later on. So this snapshot is a heat map of all the burn permit data in the Southeast, showing the density of points, and it's weighted by hectares. So, and this is over that 11-year period. So the very brightly lit areas that have the most dense amount of points it's being compared to other areas. So all the points are relative to each other. So if an area looks empty, it doesn't necessarily mean there weren't any burns there. It just means relative to other areas, there wasn't as much point density or burn permits with the high hectares. So we found there was about 23 million hectares burned in this period, or 57 million acres in this 11-year period. We did not include sugarcane burning in this particular analysis, and that it was just it kind of skewed results, and we did not consider it ecologically significant. And here's a stacked chart displaying all the hectare summation of each state for each year between 2010 to 2020. Note that some of the states did not collect spatial data for burns in like 2010. So like Alabama, you can see there in 2010, they didn't have any data. They started their system in 2011. So we try and keep track of when states actually started any sort of burn permit or burn notification system. So that's good to keep in mind, any sort of data gaps like that. So you can see generally Georgia and Florida, generally had the most burns every single year. But again, we know Texas and Oklahoma do quite a bit. So that, kind of, because they didn't have that regulated data, that wasn't showing up here. So we just need to keep that in mind. And you can also look at these heat maps, both public and private. So you can see in this public lands where the state and national forests really stick out, as well as the military bases. You can see Fort Moore, Fort Stewart, as well as Eglin. So the public lands had burned a total area of about 9 million hectares. And then the next one shows private lands. So we always love showing the little green star is where Tall Timbers is. And so if you look north of there, that's that Red Hills region where they do large amounts of burning to maintain that quail habitat. And of course, many other wildlife species really benefit of that, of course. So private lands contain the bulk of the reported burned area over that 11-year period, totaling 14 million hectares. And then we have a couple of charts. The first one on top is the sum of hectares over the years, public and private. And then the bottom one is just the mean burn hectares, and that's also by date, public and private. So in the top chart, the private lands have more overall hectares because of that more land area overall and possibly more frequent smaller size burns. So we calculated the mean burn size differed strongly between private, which was about 11 hectares, and then public was 78. So you see on that bottom chart, it shows that public lands had larger size burn on average because they didn't have that land area that's probably as fragmented. And they probably have more resources, frankly, to do these larger size burns. So we can also summarize these burn permits within a county boundary. So that's really convenient for a lot of people. Aggregating the point data, this burn point data can be helpful in assessing burning within administrative boundaries, especially if the point data is a little bit off. So a lot of states, it's not necessarily exactly where a burn may have taken place. So you need to remember that because I think a lot of people look at this data and think it's, has high accuracy and not necessarily. So I think aggregating it is very helpful and you get you a little bit better idea of these areas. There also may be private landowner concerns, so you might not want to show the raw data. So aggregating this data set can be really helpful for that as well. So when do burn permits occur in the Southeast during this whole time period? This is a graphic of a data clock. So in the very interior, the very inner circle is 2010, and then it goes all out to the outer edge of 2020. And then each wedge is a month. So you can kind of get this whole depiction of these cyclical patterns and trends over time in terms of just looking at the date. And this is one area where I think the burn permits really it's a really strong data set for that. It's going to be difficult to get that from a lot of other data sets, at least on a regional level. So the prescribed fire activity was greatest from January through April during the decade of the data set, with the month of March and February having the highest burn area. And then late February until mid-March was the hottest moment. So we also were able to get the top dates, the top burning dates, and that's in this paper I'll show you at the end if you want more information. You can refer to this paper. But all of those top 10 dates occurred in those 2 months. And during the 6-month period between May and before November, there's very few prescribed fires, about 28% were reported across the region. So while the heat maps, they're a great visualization tool if you just want to get a general idea, we also wanted to see if neighboring points and hectares burns was statistically significant. So we did a hotspot analysis, which will help you display statistically significant hotspot clusters that are not just spatially random, but are statistically significant when weighted by the burn hectares or area values. So to be a high confidence hotspot, a burn area will have a high value surrounded by other features with high values, both in number and extent. So these high confidence hotspots were then aggregated into these U.S. Forest Service fire sheds. And these are new management containers of approximately 100,000 hectares in size. And the fire sheds are a way to delineate where fires are likely to spread to communities or not. So once aggregated into these named fire shed units, the fire sheds were ranked into a table with the top 17 fire sheds with the highest number of hotspot clusters. So, and we just did a cutoff. We just said, okay, if it gets to be greater than or equal to 1,000 with over 90% confidence, that's where we kind of cut it off to do further analysis. So, so the map displays the 17 fire sheds that had the highest hotspot count. Like I said, over 1,000 with that 90% confidence. If there were fire sheds that were adjacent to each other, like you see with the Crestview, Florida, and Antioch, Georgia, and Hullapaw, Florida, we chose the one with the highest hotspot count in that cluster to use as to be representative of that area. So we kind of shortened it down to these 9 fire sheds. So we also did further analysis where we calculated how much public and private lands are in there in that specific fire shed. And then we also did the data clocks for those as well. So you'll note that the Antioch, Georgia, Florida fire shed, Beaufort, South Carolina, Columbus, Georgia, Clayton, Alabama, Camilla, Georgia fire sheds all follow the same pattern of having the most active prescribed fires between January and April in the data clock charts, with March being the month with the greatest activity. So you can see it's really blackened in that month of March. The Hinesville, Georgia fire shed has an expanded prescribed burn window, and that's mainly where Fort Stewart's military base is. And Fort Stewart conducts prescribed burning not only for ecological reasons, but to reduce fuel loading for military training exercise, which occur from December to June. So that makes sense. And then when you go down to Hullapaw, Florida, fire shed, that is in the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge and Conservation Area. And that has a very noticeably different pattern as well, with the majority of prescribed fires occurring between January and July. It should be noted this is a large prairie habitat where the Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area, they manage for the endangered Florida grasshopper sparrow. I mean, that's one of the things species they're managing for. And that's evolved with frequent fires in the summer. So and then of course we've got Crestview, Florida area, and that has a combination of Eglin Air Force Base, Blackwater State Forest, and then the Yellow River Wildlife Management Area. And they conduct prescribed fires to maintain that longleaf habitat for the red-cockaded woodpecker and other rare plant and animal species. And then also in South Florida, you'll notice we've got Vermont, Florida, in the Babcock Ranch area, where they have maintained a winter prescribed burning regime, which is aimed at cattle forage improvement. So that was pretty interesting to see. So it's good to see, where and when these fires are taking place, and then think about why they're having, these burns at certain areas as well. And just to get a snapshot of the burn permit updates. So we are doing updates. We did updates to 2021 and then 2022. And this includes the National Fire Plant Operations and Reporting System treatment data set. And that's with the Department of Interior and the U.S. Forest Service. That will be used for all national parks, national forests, and national wildlife refuges in lieu of the state permit data. We do still have the raw permit data. So if somebody was like, I don't want to use the NIFPORs, I don't want to use the federal data, we still have the state permit data. So that's an option. And Kentucky has also been included, which I'm very happy about. And I really wanted to thank their Prescribed Fire Council. So this is a regional snapshot of what those fire sheds look like that I discussed in the hotspot analysis. So right now I have it treated by, the summation of the treated acres, or just for that 2010 through 2022 update. So again, these fire sheds are approximately 250,000 acre units that are delineated based on wildfire transmission to communities. And so that attribute information is in that fire shed. And there's also, and that's how you'll usually see it symbolized. Like if you go to the U.S. Forest Service site, it'll be symbolized by exposure levels, not the way I've got it. So you can symbolize it any way you know, what's most useful to you. And there's also, it's really nice because within each fire shed, there are also smaller project areas that are about 25,000 acres and that are nested in there, and you can use that to facilitate fire mitigation planning. So it would be good to know kind of that history of all the treated acres and then wildfire, you know, the exposure levels. So, you know, that's just another way to look at it. Some people just like looking, you know, the county level is very useful to them. So it depends on how you want to look at it. So with this fire shed, we've also put that in just a very simple dashboard. So, and I'll provide the link to that at the end. So I've got a list of, you know, all the top fire sheds that have the most burned acres. So you can just click on that. It'll zoom to that fire shed and open up all the attributes that you need to see. And then we just keep a track of all the total burned acres in the Southeast. So we're gonna try and keep this updated every year and continue on with this. If you have any suggestions about other ways you'd like to see this, please let me know. So you may be wondering, well, what are you going to do with all this data, and what, you know, why would you need to know this? We had gotten a paper out about this, and almost immediately afterwards, there was talk of this EPA rule change. So on February 7th this year, the EPA announced the final rule change to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for fine particle pollution, known as PM 2.5 or SOOD. And this change tightens the average standard from the previous level of 12 to a new level of 9 micrograms per cubic meter. So this tighter standard means areas of the country will be subject to additional regulatory burdens for prescribed fire use. This is especially true for private conservation landowners that lead the way and prescribe fire, but don't have the capacity that maybe these public agencies may have to complete more complex reporting. So we need to be able to show where private landowners are burning and when and why as well, and be able to communicate the importance of attaining our prescribed fire goals and advocate for these hotspot areas of prescribed burning. So right now we're especially looking at this Albany, Georgia area of the country. So they do a lot of burning, and it's interesting because this is where the Jones Center at Itchaway is. This is where there's a lot of quail habitat. This is where they also do a lot of ag burning. So it's an area of interest, and that is that Camilla, Georgia fire shed I'd shown you that showed up in that hotspot analysis. So that had shown up there. So basically what this is showing, this is an historical exceedance day back in 2023. What do I mean by that? It means the daily PM 2.5 had an exceedance. It went over the daily accepted value of 35. And so here we have an example on February 23rd, where we have a backward trajectory high split plume, kind of tracing back the particle pollution from the EPA sensor in Albany. So I wish I had a laser pointer, but I don't. So what you have here is, if you start at all those little dots starting up north and swooping down into central Florida, which probably they did pick up some prescribed fire activity that was going on in central Florida. And then it went back up into the Albany Georgia area at the very center, where the EPA center is. And there were a lot of local burns, but you can see from the snapshot that the pollution was not just coming from locally prescribed burns or ag burns, but from widespread regional level. So it's more complex than just looking at your local burns. And then we also, we've done this for several historical examples. So there was, for instance, the widespread burning activity was observed in the Southeast on March 23rd, 2023, where there was another exceedance, with the most noticeable areas being in South Carolina and Alabama. This produced numerous smoke plumes, majority of them moving in a southeast direction. In Albany's, in a river valley, the smoke just kind of funnels in there and will sit, sometimes, so that can be an issue. So to conclude, I really wanted to thank all the Southeastern states. We really couldn't have done this without them, all the forestry agencies, and then Fort Moore's been really good about also providing their data. What's kind of interesting about some of the military bases is Fort Moore didn't, they have their own kind of burn permit system, or burn data, I should say. So Georgia Forestry Commission did not have that, so we had to get that separately. So I just wanted to thank them. And I also wanted to thank Dr. Morgan Varner. This was actually his idea, and so really appreciate his support. And then Holly Knoll, who's our new Geospatial Program Director. We've been doing a lot of great analysis work with the air quality work she's been working on. And if you have any ideas, if there was something you saw too, that you saw an area that you thought maybe, oh, I know we have data here for every year and you want to contribute, let us know. Or if you have suggestions or ideas, please feel free to contact me. I'm at kcummins@talltimbers.org. And then for more information, we have this Community of Fire story map. And that is David Godwin's brother there on that site. And this also has the embedded dashboard that I was talking about with the fire sheds. So yeah, if you want to play around with that and you've got ideas for further work on that, just let me know. And if you really want to dive deep and find, what we did with all of this, we also have a fire journal publication on the Southeastern U.S. prescribed fire database. So like I said, we really, it is really a fire community in the Southeast, and we really want to keep that and foster that any way we can, and look at things on a regional level. So this has been really helpful for us. So thank you.
Well, Karen, thank you so much for your presentation. I know we've already got some questions that are coming in. If you joined us during Karen's talk, my name is David Godwin, and I'm with the Southern Fire Exchange in the University of Florida. And our presentation was by Karen Cummins. She's the Geospatial Administrator for Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee. So at this point, we have time for open question and answer regarding the project and the presentation. So if you do have questions, please make sure you put them in the Q&A tool in Zoom so that we can get to those. And Karen, I'm going to go ahead and start going through some of these questions, and I'll read them aloud so you can address them. One of the first ones we had that came on was from Brody. And Brody says, can you elaborate further on how sugarcane burning skews the burn data regarding the heat map shown previously? Is it because of the way sugarcane is burned or how emissions are calculated?
No, it just, so all it's looking at is point density and the acres and the hectares burned. So it basically kind of dominated everything. And so we didn't find that very helpful. We do have that in the database. So if somebody's wanting to do research on air quality, they're probably going to want to look at sugarcane burning. And we do have that. So if somebody requested that data, that's not a problem. But just for this analysis that we did, it kind of dominated things. And so we wanted to get a clearer picture of other burns going on. So, and I was hesitant to cut out like all ag burning because some of it I think is quite helpful. I mentioned the Babcock Ranch area, you know, but that's, you can, and some of the states didn't have even burn types. So I just felt I didn't want to I wouldn't know what to cut out necessarily because of that. So I don't want you to assume like, oh, I had knew every kind of burn type in the entire Southeast that wasn't available in this situation. So some states do track that and some don't.
So for some states, ag burning may have been included in the points,
Yes,
and for
yes.
other states, it was not reported by the
Just,
state.
yeah, the only thing that was taken out was sugarcane.
Okay. And so
Does that make sense?
yeah, so pile burning, how does that fit in? Do you
It
know?
didn't have, so that wasn't included. And if something did sneak in like that, it was usually 0 acres. So it really didn't. We always tried to weight things by the size. So if it would just wind up being 0 acres, it really wouldn't make much of a difference if something like that snuck in. But yeah, we did try and leave that out.
So here's another question in the Q&A. Are there any plans in the Southeast for a voluntary system for non-permit areas, for a voluntary inputting system for non-permit areas? So that's a good question. Is there a mechanism or a way that areas where they don't have a prescribed fire permitting system in place at the state level for submitting burn data, I guess, to you guys, I think is what the person is requesting?
Yeah, I would. There's been lots of talk of that, so I wouldn't be surprised if something. There's been talk of a mobile app, a more of a region-wide mobile app, and yeah, if anybody's interested in that, and we want to maybe start spearheading that, that would be great. And like I said, you can always, if you just want to submit data to us and we'll include it in the geodatabase, we'll do that. We'll try, we'll make sure it's not being double counted, obviously, but.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question about fire sheds. Could you talk about what a fire shed is and how they're defined for folks who are not familiar with that concept?
Yeah, it's a new kind of management container with the U.S. Forest Service. So if you just Google U.S. Forest Service fire sheds, that'll come up. I mean, you can use any sort of aggregate container you want, but I thought that was kind of an interesting way to look at it because I believe there's some federal funding and they're doing it by fire shed and project area. So I thought, well, that would be pretty interesting to have the treated acres in that and see what that looks like. And, maybe that's, so people can start thinking about that maybe as a reporting tool, like they want to show where there's the most wildfire exposure to communities. And then, oh, well, this area is getting a lot of treatment. So, that's making progress, or that's something that could be looked at. And we haven't really taken that further, but there's And I'm pretty sure that's what's being used with the Inflation Reduction Act is the fire sheds. I think they're doing funding by that, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong about that. But that's why I chose it. But, you know, in GIS, people use these just kind of standard hexagons for spatial analysis, just so they're all the same size. And I just thought that would be kind of interesting to use fire sheds as a non-administrative boundary for that, for aggregation, but just because it had a bit more fire information in there.
Mhm.
But
We had
yeah,
a question.
there is a website. I mean,
Okay.
maybe we can include a website link to the about fire sheds, maybe on the YouTube
Yep, we can pull that
page
up
for
and add
this.
that into the recording for sure.
Yeah.
We had a question from Ben Williams asking about smoke sheds, and I don't know if you can see it in the Q&A, but Ben is asking if there's a way to add data on smoke sheds from individual permits forecast on the smoke screening when the permits were issued. So I think Ben is trying to get to an idea of where you have this map of all this permit data. Is there also data that could be shown on maybe the smoke screening that occurred at the time the permit was issued? I think that's where Mr. Williams is going on that one. As a way of kind of seeing where the smoke might have been going in the past for a lot of these different prescribed fires when the
Yeah,
permit.
and that's what we were kind of looking at with that historical exceedance. We haven't done that too much. Holly Knoll, who's going to be speaking, I think, for the next round, of course, she's going to be talking about Southeast Fire Map. She's more of our air quality smoke expert at Tall Timbers, but we are looking a lot at that for the Albany area and doing some smoke modeling, and like that is something we're kind of looking at for pile burns. So we are getting some of that now for Georgia, just so we can do some modeling for that and seeing, and it is interesting. Yeah, we do need to be doing more on, looking how this is going to be, with smoke management. We just need to be looking at these forecasts a lot in a different way, I think. And yeah, I mean, I think getting a grip on what happened historically is very helpful. So we can, improve our models. So
And Ben, if we didn't get that to the root of your question, please send us an email and let us know, and we can try and figure out how to address that more thoroughly. We had another question from Joe Royce, and Joe is asking if wildfires are included in the database.
no, it's just prescribed fire. So, like I know, like Florida, well, in Florida and Georgia, they have a separate database layer for their incidents. So that's kept, that kind of data is usually kept separately. And so we just always ask for the prescribed fire authorizations. And
It does seem like, though, with the, I think, probably unprecedented number of prescribed fire records that are contained within your database, within the Tall Timbers database that you guys have created, if you are able to bring in wildfire spatial data, it would allow you to look at some really interesting questions about potential trends between prescribed fire use and wildfire occurrence on certain landscapes.
yeah, it was interesting. We did look at Karen Short's wildfire database. So we do have that historical. So we have done some analysis with that. And, one of the things that we want to do with Southeast Fire Map that Holly Knoll is going to talk about next week is, which is a burned area product, how are we, it would be great if we can, kind of parse out what's a wildfire and what's a prescribed burn in that burned area product. And, that's, and we are hoping to at least, I was thinking, well, you could at least kind of get where you're, okay, this is probably a high probability that was a, prescribed burn, or it was a high probability of it being a wildfire. You could probably get to a pretty good confidence level, probably, looking at both of those data sets, but.
We had a question from Lou, and Lou says, so unless military bases report burns to state forestry, is it not tracked? So could you comment on your DoD fire records?
Yeah, so when we first did the database, it was very obvious that Fort Moore was missing in Georgia. And so, I mean, we knew they did a lot of burning. And so we asked about that, and they just did so Fort Moore just did a reporting to Georgia Forestry. And I think they had some, it looked like they had some permits, but it didn't show up brightly like it does now. And so we asked Fort Moore for data, and they provided it. Eglins shows up. I mean, they've maybe got more intricate data set that's, where they've got completed burns. So if you went to every military base, you might get, a really comprehensive data set just for that. And Fort Stewart, I mean, I thought we'd have there wouldn't be any data showing up for that, but it popped out, and we may not have all of it, but that definitely showed up. So, I can't guarantee, we've got every single military base, unfortunately, but I think for Florida, that's pretty good data, but other states, yeah, it might be a little hit or miss.
We had a comment from Ryan, and Ryan says, I support the America's Longleaf Restoration Initiatives, their annual accomplishment reporting. Ryan says, we collect data across the 9 longleaf states. For prescribed fire, it's mostly direct reported by agencies, organizations, and programs. For Georgia and Alabama, we do utilize burn permit data because they have an is it longleaf option in their state permit tracking systems. I'd love to see how your permit geodatabase can crosswalk with longleaf to identify trends and burning. I'm thinking about the Southeast longleaf ecosystem geodatabase that has 5-ish million acres of longleaf identified.
Yeah, and I think there's been some discussion of that. Nothing's really, I don't think we've done anything with it thus far, but yeah, there's definitely been some discussion about that. But yeah, that would be a pretty interesting analysis looking at that. And that's what we want to, we want to make sure these longleaf areas are getting that fire frequency, and continue to. So yeah, if you want to, if you're interested in looking at that data, the data we have, let us know, just contact me. It's not a problem.
So one more question in the Q&A here. And he says, on a separate note, just curious, how can fine particulate pollution be reduced when implementing a prescribed fire?
Oh, that's a great question. That's what everybody's trying to find out. So it's good if you have rather high transport winds to kind of move things along so the smoke doesn't sit there. So that's one thing people look at, and just planning things out, doing a smoke modeling plume beforehand. And we're trying to get more tools available to private landowners. So just so you have all the information about the weather and smoke management that you need. So like for Georgia, they use this V-smoke model, and that's available online. We've got YouTube videos about how to use that. So yeah, there's several different tools that I think anybody, would have an easy time using, and understanding, but And just making sure your smoke's not going to some, towards some smoke sensitive area, like airports and nursing homes and schools. And that's a big, concern as always. So.
One of the things that we've been working on recently related to these changes in the PM 2.5 NACs is the idea of promoting best smoke management practices across the prescribed burning community. And there's a list of a basic list of these best smoke management practices, and I'll get a link for that and make sure it's included on the recording. But it includes ideas of considering meteorological and fuel conditions when you're burning, reducing smoldering combustion as if possible after the burn, and coordinating with other burners if possible, so that you're thinking about the total amount of smoke that's being put into an airshed on any given day. And I understand, and everybody understands that's challenging, because when it's a good day to burn here, it's a good day to burn there too. But it's starting to look like we're going into new environments and new era where there's extra attention going to be focused on smoke and emissions. And so as a fire community and a fire science community, it's important for us to share with one another the resources and the practices that can be put into place to help make sure that we can all continue to manage our ecosystems. So, Karen, we're starting to wrap things up a little bit here. I was curious, could you talk about the future of the project? And are you guys planning to add more data every year going forward, or is this something that you see continuing into the future?
Yes, so we do a data ask every single year, and we, aggregate things all together, and we're trying to update this every year. So, and I see, it's really interesting because I see this data improving like every single year. Like more and more states are, they're collecting GIS information on their burns or burn permits, and that's been real. So it's you can get really optimistic about what's gonna come in the future. So it's exciting about that. So
All right. Well, thanks, Karen. Thanks everybody for all the questions. Karen, did you have any other final comments or things that you wanted to share with everybody today?
Sure. I just wanted to give a thank you to everyone. And, when I first did this, I thought, oh, this data will just be used for research. I didn't realize it was also could be used for advocacy. So to show when and where and why people are burning, and especially private landowners. And we want to keep that going so they can attain their their prescribed burning goals. And, we need that fire frequency on the landscape, not just for animals, but for us too.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. If you would like to follow up with Karen, we've got her contact information on the screen there. You can email her and follow up. And so with that, thanks everybody. We hope this webinar will be useful in your fire management programs. And thanks, Karen, for sharing your work and the work of your team with us.
Thanks, David.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everybody.